Winning Time. It's a show about the legacy of the Los Angeles Lakers during the 1980s. Pretty interesting topic because a lot of those people are still alive. And, it harkens really back to my childhood. So, what is it about? It is about basically when Jerry Buss purchased the Lakers 1979, 1980, and then when Magic Johnson joined the Lakers right out of college. The show follows that. The show follows their original season, and then hopefully we'll get some more future seasons. They have already announced a season 2, so apparently it was really popular. That's what the show's about. It's covering all of the complexity of the first season that Magic Johnson was on the Lakers. I'll talk about a little bit more what that looks like, but it's a pretty compelling show, and it's done in a very interesting way. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Really fun fact about this show. I've worked with one of the performers in this show. Kirk Boville is a friend of mine on Facebook, but also somebody that I've worked a couple times with on short films. And then I just want to talk a little bit about Adam McKay's style. I mentioned Adam McKay earlier. So Adam McKay is sort of shepherding this particular show. And you can imagine that a show about the Los Angeles Lakers is going to be pretty complex. A lot of people remember this era, right? Like, this is not like all that long ago. We're talking about, what is it now, 30 years ago that these things, maybe 40 years ago that these things were coming out. I was born in the early 80s, so I was not quite around to see this in person because I would have been too young, but saw some of it later in the 80s, right? As I was a kid watching basketball on TV and things. So it is really fun to revisit this era. It was a very unique era, I think, in terms of Los Angeles and what was going on in Los Angeles at the time. It's a very different era than what we find ourselves in 2022, to a large degree. This was an era where a lot of people were moving to California because California was a cool place to be. This is Hollywood in the 1980s really took off. You can remember some of the biggest we just talked about recently. I talked with my buddy Mike Biondo. We talked about the Blues Brothers on this show. If you go back a couple episodes, you can find that. And that's those kinds of movies started this huge Hollywood expansion, if you will. Like, things got really, like, how often do you hear about a movie from the 70s that isn't Star Wars, right? It's not very often, but we got, Raiders of the Lost Ark in the early 80s, all of the Star Wars films in the 80s. Hollywood just exploded from a blockbuster perspective, particularly in the 80s. And a lot of that was seen. So California was seen through the lens of Hollywood, but also seen through the lens of sports. And growing up in that kind of era, I can remember it seeming like Hollywood was like the place to be, right? Now, there was a lot of things that came along with that were pretty interesting. And Adam McKay here with Winning Time showcases a lot of that, because he showcases, like, this is what kind of, I don't know about if I would say the height, but it was definitely a popular era for like Playboy magazine. And, this is still an era where we'd moved past the 50s and 60s. So there were more females in the workforce, but sexual harassment was like a really big deal and was still very active in some of these circles. And the show showcases some of that, right? For example, Jerry Buss, who purchases the Lakers early on in this show, he was a guy that liked to run in these circles. He was a guy who he even has a Forum club so the Lakers used to play at the Forum, which eventually was a church at one point in time, by the way. But at the Forum, he had a Forum club, and there was a lot of women and booze and probably drugs there. Some of that is showcased a little bit in the show itself. So this was a pretty interesting time. People were very much looking for the next biggest thing, and they wanted to associate themselves with some of these cool factors, whether it was Hollywood or whether it was basketball or whatever. In fact, a lot of the stars in this show, a lot of the basketball players, you can hear them talking about Hollywood. And even in one of the earlier shows, Magic Johnson sort of attends a premiere. So there was a lot going on in the 80s, and having grown up as a kid of the 80s, this show kind of takes us back into that era and showcases some of the things that were really cool about that era, but also some of the things that were pretty challenging about that era as well. I do want to mention Adam McKay's style. Adam McKay has done Vice. He did Don't Look Up, which is on Netflix right now, was nominated for an Oscar. He did The Big Short, which had a bunch of Oscar performances in it, I believe, and probably was nominated for an Oscar itself in some way, shape, or form. Adam McKay's style is very distinctive. You could compare Adam McKay's style to like what The Office would look like if it was not intended to be funny, but more intended to be more dramatic. He will break the fourth wall occasionally. He does a lot of close-ups. It's very documentary style. In this particular show, he does something really fascinating, which is he films it as if it was filmed on cameras that were available in the 1980s, right? So you get now very technical people will know what that means. I don't, because I'm assuming it's like 35 millimeter film or something like that. But I don't know the technical term. I'm a writer and a producer. I don't get into the technical parts of film production, but he does a fantastic job of capturing all of those things in a style that is super compelling to watch on TV. And I highly recommend just even looking at the style that he presents to us in the 1980s and the way the way he captures all of these characters makes them very realistic as to what I remember as a kid. Now it's probably our memories as we wanted them to be, as opposed to the memories about how things actually were. But he's not afraid to touch the nitty-gritty of these things either, which brings me to the performances. The performances are fantastic throughout the entire season. I mean, Adam McKay has always had performers who have done a fantastic job in every single one of the movies that he's done. I think you would easily say that the performances were great. The Big Short and Vice, those performances are stellar performances by just about everyone involved in those films. Don't Look Up is a slightly different take because it's a little bit more comedic than I think it's intended to be, a little bit more comedic than some of his previous stuff. All of his stuff includes comedy, but I think Don't Look Up is supposed to be like even a little bit more comedy. So the performances may not be as totally dramatic and maybe a little bit more over the top in that one. So maybe not to my preference, but a bunch of people love that movie and, got an Oscar nomination. So obviously it's a big deal. But here in this show, the performances are off the charts. I mean, these are real characters, right? These are, I should say, real people that are showcased as characters. And I don't think the show is going for, just like in the past with his other movies, the show is not going for a historical accuracy of the people involved. What he's going for from a storytelling perspective, this is amazing. This is why he's so good and why so many people like him. What he's looking for is he's looking for what was the drama in these people's lives, right? And then he gives every character a reason to be dramatized in a way that goes along with what we would expect their character to be facing. So let me give you a couple of examples. Jerry Buss is a guy who was not involved in basketball, sort of a self-made millionaire, as the show points out. Guy who loves his mom, guy who loves women, very big womanizer, guy who loves his family too. So what is that guy's thing that he's struggling with? Well, he's struggling with the fact that he's not super respected by the other basketball owners, but he's a very competitive guy. He's a very friendly guy. And so when people get after him and like don't act like his friend very much, that hurts him. And so then he has to fight back and he has to compete back. When things happen in his family that are difficult, he has to kind of struggle through that because he's a guy who doesn't want to think about bad things. He's a guy who just wants to focus on the goals he has. That's pretty compelling. His daughter, Jeannie Buss, who is now the current owner of the Lakers, since he was Dr. Jerry Buss. I think he was an honorary doctorate, but he's since passed. But his daughter now owns the team, and she's in this show. What does she struggle with? Well, she struggles with the fact that her dad's a womanizer and has that 80s mindset of where women belong in the workplace and where they don't belong in the workplace. And she's actually one of the best employees that he has in some regards. So, and then Magic Johnson, what's he going through? Well, there's another player, Larry Bird, who also shows up as a rookie in this season, in the 1980 season. And Larry Bird is getting a lot of the accolades. Why? Largely because Larry Bird is white, right? Fascinating place to put Magic Johnson. So it's not that these are going to be like a true life story of like every single event that took place in real life also takes place in the show in the exact way it did in real life. It's more so saying these are some of the things that these people at this time were likely struggling with, and then we will dramatize those things to make it really compelling on TV. So, of course, there's creative license with that, right? This is not a depiction of, this is not a biography of any of these characters. This is a dramatization of the Los Angeles Lakers in the 1980s and all of the characters that played a role in that. And this show, it's, I think it captures it all pretty well. And it is a fascinating season of the Los Angeles Lakers. I'm not going to spoil anything, but there are some big twists and turns here. And I mean, going back to the performances, I mean, everybody across the board does such a good job here. You get lost. It's almost like you're just watching. I mean, the guy who plays Magic Johnson, I don't know his name. This is I believe, one of the first roles that he's done, is phenomenal. Also, fun fact, I watched the behind the scenes features. The guy is not very tall. So they do a lot of I mean, this is like they take Lord of the Rings type forced perspective and they put people's in ways that they look really a lot taller than other people that they may not be actually in real life. So really, really well done. Going back in this time frame and seeing the 1980s represented is really, really fun. And this is not really a show about basketball. So a lot of you guys, you listen to this show, you've never heard me talk about sports probably ever, right? And I used to be a lot more into sports when I was younger. And then once I got into storytelling and once I got into writing books and making some films and things like that, I just haven't had the time to watch as many sports. But I used to like sports a lot when I was a kid. And I remember they used to be called the Showtime Lakers, but that must be copywritten somewhere because the show's called Winning Time, not Showtime. So it must have something to do with copyright or something. But this is a very compelling show. Just some storytelling things that it does that I find really fascinating. I mentioned some of these already, but the characters all have goals and objectives, and it's difficult for them to achieve them. And there's all these twists and turns along the way, and they have to make commitments in order to achieve those goals and objectives. And when two people's goals collide with one another, it creates all of this tension, which is really, really good, very compelling. All the characters are really fleshed out really, really well. I mean, these feel like real people on screen. And I think that the show, I've mentioned this already because of the dramatization aspect of the show, but this show is really more true to how people felt about the Lakers and about Los Angeles in the 1980s, maybe more than it is about the reality of the situation, right? And I don't think the show is trying to be real. It's trying to showcase this is how we all felt about this era, especially in Los Angeles, right? And a lot of the people involved in the show actually lived in LA during this era. So they have a context by which they can view this framework. And I found the show very fun. I found it. I mean, it's certainly adults. So just know going in, like probably not a show you want to watch with your kids. It's not enough about basketball. It's more about the lives of everybody involved. But I would say that it's easily one of the best shows in 2022 thus far, particularly on HBOMax. So it is worth a watch. If you were into the early 80s or into the Lakers at all, or wondered about what was happening in that decade, then check it out. Probably not a lot of people who watch my show or listen to my show, probably not made for you, but just know that I took a chance on it because, again, a kid of the 80s in Los Angeles, I really wanted to listen to it, and I thought it was really fun. So definitely check that out.